Thank you for joining us this afternoon for what is part one of Powering the Green Recovery with Marine Energy. In this session, we will explore the role that hydrogen has to play as an enabler for the marine energy sector. I'm Philippa Powell, Business Development Manager at RWE Renewables and Project Lead for our entry into the Celtic Sea floating wind leasing round. I'm joined today by our panel of experts, running not as they are seated here. We have Inez Tunga, who's Renewables Practice Manager at Energy Systems Catapult, Michelle Hitches, Energy Systems Project Manager at ORE Catapult, Tim James, Infrastructure Development Director at Celtic Sea Power, Gito Owen, Director at Glan, specialising in hydrogen and fuel cells. Gito is also Project Manager for the Mentamorn Holyhead Hydrogen Hub and Coordinator of High Cymru. And last but not least, Jeremy Smith. Hi, Jeremy.
Hi.
Business Development Manager at RWE.
Yeah, regulatory and subsidy manager.
Sorry.
But yeah.
Totally blanked you then, sorry. Hydrogen is seen by many as the only current option for decarbonising large parts of the economy and delivery of energy security and resilience. Other countries are already developing at scale, which we can learn from, and Wales is very well placed to develop a sizable green hydrogen value chain from offshore energy. There is no one-size-fits-all. Our hydrogen experts are working on a roadmap from emerging technology to meet cost and performance improvements, requiring to overcome economic, technical challenges, change in policy regulations and investment strategies. From the micro pilot projects through to macro projects capable of delivering beyond gigawatt scale hydrogen, I invite our expert panellists to talk us through their various hydrogen projects, starting with Inez.
Thank you for that, Philippa. Like you mentioned, there's no one size fits all when we look at hydrogen. And for most of you, you probably know the wind sector has gone through the same steps, where we started from a roadmap of proving concept to demonstrator to now a large-scale organization, really. So the opportunities and time scale will vary based on the geographical location, based on local energy demands, based on the regional target and priorities as well. At the Energy Systems Catapult, the aim really is to accelerate the UK to net zero, and that's by supporting innovators to get to commercialization so we can deliver a future energy system, so looking at the whole energy systems aspect. And that includes technical, commercial, policies, etc. There's a few projects we have been involved with alongside our sister company, the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult. One of them is the Milton Haven Energy Kingdom that Michelle is going to kind of talk about. We are also working on the ITEC project, which is the integrated tidal energy with electrolyzer in Orkney. And I think the last panel, they kind of mentioned some of the projects already. We've also looked at, we kind of went back as well a little bit and looking at the supply itself. Mm-hmm. So yes, hydrogen, but how do we get to hydrogen? How do we get the supply ready for, how do we use the excess? So we need to produce enough of the supply. So we did recently, we finished a project on DT Ocean Plus. Some of the findings were not only do we have to advance, like you say, performance improvement, cost improvement, but we also need to find the right market for those technologies. And when we look at niche market, we're looking at hydrogen can be one, oil and gas can also be another one. There's aquaculture and different other niche markets. I guess my point here is hydrogen is one of the many solutions that can be integrated with the renewables, with offshore renewables. We also are looking at battery solutions. We're also looking at grids balancing. Currently, we're supporting one of the Welsh Government projects on future grids. What are the grid needs? What are the grid upgrade requirements to make this transition to net zero? Another aspect, like I was touching on, understanding the local needs is actually quite important, because yes, hydrogen can be suitable for industrial decarbonization with the industrial clusters that we are seeing at the moment, but at local level it can also mean a different thing. So we're also supporting a local area energy planning project for the Meads wells, looking at how the whole energy system as a whole first should behave, or what are the priorities and what are the elements of the systems that need to be met before we talk about hydrogen. I'll let the others maybe jump in.
So thank you, Inez. Let's move on to Michelle, and this is your 5 minutes to talk through your project experiences.
Yeah, that's fine. So I'm going to talk to you about the Milford Haven Energy Kingdom project. So this is an Innovate UK funded project with 5 partners, ourselves, Pembrokeshire County Council, River Simple, Wales and West Utilities, and the Port of Milford Haven. And then we've got 2 main subcontractors, Arup and Energy Systems Catapult, doing some of the more in-depth technical work for us. So the aim of the project is to produce a blueprint for a smart local energy system for Milford Haven, but one that's replicable so that you can pick it up and put it in other rural communities, sort of the same size. So as part of the project, we've got 2 demonstrators. So we've got a transport demonstrator and a heating demonstrator. So on the Milford Marina, we're producing green hydrogen on site, with 2 naphtha electrolyzers, storing it there then and refueling 2 River Simple Razza cars. And then for our heating system, we've got a smart hydrogen hybrid heating system based in a commercial building at the Port of Milford Haven's headquarters. We picked that building because it's the same size as a 3-bedroom bungalow, so you can sort of match it across. The reason we picked a commercial building was, at the moment, the hydrogen boilers can only be tested in empty buildings for insurance reasons. So that's why we picked that, because obviously we don't want people to move out of their homes when we're doing it. So we've got a prototype boiler with an air source heat pump and smart controls. So we've recently done 2 world first trials, one with an 80-20 blend, and then we did 100% hydrogen. So for the 80-20 blend, we didn't have to change anything. We could just use a normal commercial boiler. And then for the 100%, Worcester Bosch were very kind to lend us their prototype boiler to swap out and then do the 100% trial, and they all went absolutely fine. So these trials are to do proof of concept rather than looking at the cost reductions. So we're just coming to the end of the project now, and there's a whole series of reports that will come out. Energy System Catapult have done the systems architecture and trading platform reports, which is already available on our website. In the oncoming weeks, there will be the final Smart Local Energy System report, which has commercial, financial and economic modelling attached to it. We've got 3 stepping stone investable propositions, so that basically anyone could invest in straight away. We've got a business case for hydrogen transport, which will be coming out in May. Interestingly, we've done some consumer feedback on what people feel the barriers of moving their house over to hydrogen would be. There's been some really interesting feedback from that, which will be released in the next 2 weeks. And then Passive UK have done the heating demonstrator report, which will be released by the end of this week. And then finally, we've got one report which is looking at how Milford Haven can fit into local markets, but also into the national hydrogen market.
That's great, thank you. Look forward to those reports coming out in due course. Next on to Tim for your 5 minutes of project time.
Thanks, Philippa. Good afternoon, everybody. I guess for those of you who came to Marine Energy Wales, I think it was in Milford Haven in 2016, you would have seen a presentation that I prepared. I didn't deliver it for personal reasons, but I prepared it around, it was a hydrogen project I was working on called the Haven Energy Bridge. And what we were looking to do was to electrolyse from the solar farm that we had up in Milford Haven and inject it into the NTS system with a bit of storage as well, so you could store the hydrogen and then pass it back through a fuel cell to create baseload generation for the benefit of the Milford Dock asset that we owned at the time. It was a network innovation competition project. National Grid were involved, Costain were involved, ITM were involved, and obviously I was working at the Port of Milford Haven then, so we were working on that. And the whole point of it was, to try and do more terrestrial renewable development. The grids were getting constrained as more and more developers were building solar farms and wind farms, and the network couldn't handle it. And we saw the pipeline opportunity that the NTS system could do as a mainline artery of getting energy out of the local energy system as a real opportunity. It passed the screening with Ofgem, and there were two hydrogen projects, High Deploy, which was a kind of similar project in what they were trying to do, but they were doing it on a private university up in Kiel, and there was our project. And I think, as we went through the main submission process, there were some real challenges around this technology and getting it into the system, both from a regulatory perspective, a commercial perspective, and a technical perspective. I'm not going to go into sort of what they were, because we've only got a couple of minutes, but if we can, if the question and the opportunity arises throughout the session, I can pull out not only sort of those issues, but where we are at the moment and what I'm observing at the moment in relation to sort of where those stakeholders are to overcome those challenges, which is really important because we're 8 years on, and those questions are still just about works being undertaken to inform sort of how those issues are going to get overcome. The long and short of it is that project just failed miserably, which in some ways it failed miserably. We shelved it because it just wasn't viable. But the really kind of but High Deploy did get funded, and it's led to some really good, interesting stuff, which is great. What did come from that, though, and what's really important, is that I think it got us as an energy port noticed by key stakeholders, local and national. So it aligned the Port of Milford Haven in that process. It got Milford Waterfront as a retail and leisure destination, aligned through Welsh Government's Smart Living Initiative, which then led to introduction into Innovate UK, applications into Prospering for the Energy Revolution. Milford Haven Energy Kingdom came out of that. When the Swansea-based City deal was then kind of embryonic, and they were looking for people who were positively disrupting the energy industry to try and solve these kind of big challenges, they came knocking on the door, so we started presenting that, and I pitched sort of the smart energy system in Pembroke Dock Marine to the region. Pembroke Dock Marine got chosen, and that's in operation now, which is really positive. So there's don't be afraid to push and don't be afraid to fail, because out of the ashes comes the opportunity. But that sort of brings me up to date, really.
Thanks, Tim. Now on to Jeremy.
Hi, lovely to be here. Good to see you. So I'm the Regulatory and Subsidy Manager for RWE, so my job is to try and persuade stakeholders, government officials, those kind of people, to effectively do hydrogen and do it in a way that our green hydrogen development business can, make a living on it in the UK. As a company, we want to be net zero by 2040. We've got a lot of money to spend on CapEx for projects. I think it's 15 billion. In terms of green hydrogen production targets, we want to deliver 2 gigawatts of that. We've got core markets of UK, Netherlands and Germany. We set up a hydrogen team in late 2020, and since then we've kind of gone from 0 to approximately 70 people within the hydrogen team, which is part of RWE Generation. But we also have people working on hydrogen within every single business within the group. So supply and trading, renewables, the lot. What are we working on? So we're a green hydrogen development business. The UK is colour agnostic when it comes to hydrogen. We're potentially an off-taker for hydrogen as well, so via decarbonised power stations. And one project that we've got that we're working on is called the Pembroke Net Zero Centre, which is really a combination of a number of projects, but it kind of brings them together as a centre of excellence based down in Pembroke. We're working on Celtic Sea floating offshore wind, which Philippa leads on. We're also looking at power station decarbonisation, and we got some money from South Wales Industrial Cluster for that, where we're looking at blends of hydrogen into the power station and also conversion of some of the units to hydrogen. Ultimately, the government wants us to convert that power station to be net zero compliant by 2035, which is quite a big challenge. The third pillar of the Pembroke Net Zero Centre is a green hydrogen project, which is really it's potentially 3 projects or 3 phases of the same project. So the initial phase is 110 megawatts or so of electrolytic hydrogen production. And the way we see that, it'll probably be built by 2025, 2026. And I'll caveat all this that, you know, the policy regime is currently emerging. There isn't a subsidy mechanism. You know, the government is still working on a lot of this stuff. There isn't a planning system that's obvious. So everything is kind of caveated that the rules that the government put in place need to fit to make this work. If the rules don't fit, then it might be a slightly smaller or different project. So initially 110 megawatts, mostly for industrial purposes, a small amount of transport. We'll look to connect to the grid. We'll look to effectively demonstrate the use of renewables via REGOs and corporate PPAs, and that allows us to get a mixed input of electricity because our off-taker wants a steady supply of hydrogen. The next phase is just a ramping up of that, so another 200 to 300 megawatts or so. And the final phase, which is far more interesting to this group probably, is gigawatt scale electrolysis linked to floating offshore wind, and an awful lot of legislative and other kind of policy hurdles need to be put in place to make that happen, not least, you know, a route to market for the hydrogen, such as 100% hydrogen backbone. A couple other things that we're working on. We're working with the Catapult on a project called Hyper that's funded by Welsh Government, and that's looking at the interface between offshore renewable turbines and electrolysers. Quite a useful piece of work, so we're a supporter of that. And just to give you an idea of some of our projects in elsewhere in Europe, and most of our projects are in Europe, we're working on a project called Aquaventus in Germany. So the idea of this one is to connect 10 gigawatts of offshore wind to a hydrogen hub that will be located on an island in the North Sea, and then there will be a hydrogen pipeline from there that comes onshore and then supplies industrial decarbonisation on the coast of Germany. The island is the island of Heligoland, and we've got a number of partners that we're working with on that project, the likes of, but it's not an exclusive list, Vattenfall, Shell, Gas Uni, who are a supplier of a gas pipeline operator, Siemens and Vestas, who make turbines. So that's an idea of the sort of scale of our ambition that I think we have. I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's great, Jeremy. Thank you. And now on to Gito.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, pnawn da. Braf iawn bod yma'n Llandudno ar diwrnod braf iawn, a mae hyd yn braf yn Llandudno, mae'n debyg, yn dydi? Yn wedi gadw yma'r blwyddyn. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here this afternoon. Great to meet everybody, and it's lovely hearing all those stories, actually. So I've been involved with hydrogen for over 10 years in terms of R&D days and working with universities. And until quite recently, it's been seen as a kind of future technology. So things have changed amazingly in the last year or two, and these are just examples of those projects. Back in 2012, I picked up the phone to the organisers of the then European Hydrogen Road Tour. Toyota, Daimler, Honda and Hyundai, if I remember them. They were bringing their fuel cell cars from Sweden through Germany to the Paris Motor Show. So being a fan of hydrogen, I said, come over to Cardiff and we'll put on a show there and we'll put on a UK leg. They agreed, I panicked, but then one thing led to another. We organised this tour. So this is 2012. The technology worked back then. Yes, it was expensive. Daimler gave me the keys to the little C-Class, I think it was, car, which was parked in my drive overnight. The car cost more than my house. It's not a small house in the middle of Cardiff, but the technology was expensive. And that's part of the narrative of where it's been seen, yeah, until very recently. Future technology is too expensive. Yes, it has a niche, but it'll come sometime in the future. But what's been demonstrated now is, and the words like business models, off-takers, and plans, which are, yes, emerging in Wales, real projects, the Holyhead Hydrogen Hub, which I'll come to in a second, but many others as well. There's kind of hubs of activity taking place across Wales, but they're, I guess, nothing compared to what's happening elsewhere across the world. Jeremy's mentioned that massive project in the North Sea. I think Spain, a few weeks ago, with 5 gigawatt solar to wind and onto ammonia, or it could have been methanol, but anyway, a hydrogen derivative. And that just gives you an example of the scale of projects in Europe, let alone worldwide. But where we are here in Wales is having a very good location to really capitalise on the opportunities and building on all the problems of the last 10 or 20 years. You're more familiar with them than I am. Grid constraints, development constraints, consents and all the language and these words which have been discussed at length here today, where we can use some of that learning to apply and hopefully remove some of the bottlenecks in terms of developing the green hydrogen value chain. Let alone the terrible events, and our reliance on gas from Russia and elsewhere, we can decouple from those sources, which again would have been technically viable until recently, but the cost imperative now is even better, and the costs are coming down all the time. I'll mention the European scene as a precursor to coming back to Wales. Some of you may be aware that a couple of weeks ago the EC published its EU plans, RE-Power EU, I think it was called, where they've really ramped up now. They're supercharging green hydrogen as part of their overall packages of measures for dealing with energy security and climate change. So it's come from being a niche, nice researchy type area to being at the mainstream of European policy. UK policy will probably reflect that, and it would be great if we in Wales managed to capture some of those inevitable directions of travel, but developed an industry here in Wales with our ownership of the product and products as well, that green hydrogen value chain. And an example of that, I guess, if you're looking for specific examples, we've heard a few today, these hubs emerging, is the Holyhead Hydrogen Hub with colleagues from Menter Môn, where we saw that there's an opportunity to do something on Ynys Môn in terms of kick-starting hydrogen production. And that one thing has led to another with good support from the Welsh government, leading to the potential of more support from the UK government as well, on a hydrogen hub which will meet transport applications to begin with, but that can kind of be a flag in the sand for other things. More transport to meet councils' decarbonisation targets. There's only so many ways that you can fuel cars and large vehicles especially, and I think the dust is settling now that hydrogen is appropriate for the larger range especially. So if we know that the markets are emerging, then we can develop these green hydrogen value chains, local embedded ownership, pragmatically working with others, of course, who've got expertise and bringing that in from other countries to develop those projects here in Wales. So yeah, it's a very exciting time, yeah? I mean, a couple of years ago, people like me would have mentioned hydrogen and you'd have had polite nods and people would have crossed the street and moved on. Now people are, if not literally, but metaphorically knocking on my door and others who are in the hydrogen space. And that's one of the reasons why I and others have established Hi Cymru, the Wales Hydrogen Trade Association, and there'll be a couple of announcements on that in the next few weeks in order to capture, matchmake, broker partnerships, but in the scheme of today, hopefully forge closer relations with Marine Energy Wales, also with our UK Cymru as well, because we have common concerns across the industry in order to release that capacity. So yeah, it's a clarion call as much as anything else. There's real projects taking place. They can scale up very, very quickly, but it will happen more quickly if the off-takers are pinpointed, and I think all the other parts of the chain can meet that aim. But one more message as well is the skills, yeah? We've got plenty of skills in oil and gas and current renewables which can transfer, and if Wales is going to get ahead of the game, then we need to ramp up that skills training. But the good news there as well is colleges, FE colleges, including Group Llandrillo Menai, based here, but others across Wales, are now gearing up for that skills agenda to train people up for all the job opportunities. So yeah, it's a very healthy prospect. Things can happen more quickly than they otherwise would, but obviously there's a few links in the chain which have to stack up as quickly as possible. And I know there's a few Welsh Government colleagues here today as well, so you were instrumental in this. On the one hand, don't get in the way, but on the other hand, provide some measures and opportunities which accelerate those opportunities as well. Okay, diolch yn fawr.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Gito. It's wonderful to hear all these stories, both from small-scale Pathfinder projects through to the large-scale projects, as mentioned by Jeremy. Even for those projects that didn't work out so well in the end, there's some important lessons to learn from those for the whole industry. Let's explore in more detail key opportunities for hydrogen production. Whether you knew it or not, I ran a small poll with all of you yesterday via email just to gather your thoughts on what are the key opportunities. So the main bullet points that I noted from each of you were energy security, delivery and beyond of gigawatt scale hydrogen and energy, large domestic offtake potential, matching variable production rates to end consumer demands. I'm going to pick on Michelle. In terms of delivery of beyond gigawatt scale, what do you see the time scales involved with reaching the gigawatt scale hydrogen delivery?
I'm not sure that's a fair question for me. I think we need to deal with the challenges first about hydrogen before we can even look at the timescales for the gigawatt. And you know, you've got the sort of main challenges around the supply chain. You know, can they increase from the small projects that they're doing now to move to the gigawatt scale? Mm-hmm. How long is it going to take them to progress for that? And then once we've worked all that out, then I think we can look at the timescales for the gigawatt scale.
Okay, so it's address the challenges first, make a clear pathway for gigawatt scale.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and then Inez, matching variable production rates to end consumer demand. Would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, I think that was some of our finding from the ITEC projects, and going into those projects we realized that, for example, when we look at Orkney, the challenges that they are facing is different than, like I was saying earlier on, industrial decarbonization. So where transport can be key to the near term, there might also be power generation can also be another challenge. Agriculture can come into play. Maritime. So the longer term gigawatt scale, the clear path we have at the moment, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is the industrial decarbonization, the hard to decarbonize sectors. And you mentioned already that you are part of the South Wales Industrial Decarbonization Challenge, and we have a few others in Scotland as well, and around the UK, trying to get that should I use the word serious decarbonization target, of course we are running into the challenge of how do we make all the gears work to achieve that. So there will be lots of smaller projects like the ports, like the grids, like the production itself to get to it. So 2050 is still most of the different countries in the UK objectives to get there. But the path to get there will be different based on the different regions, I believe. And then you have the near terms that can support achieving that, like your transport, like the maritime, etc.
Okay. And Guito, in terms of the near-term opportunities, where do you think the easiest opportunities are for hydrogen?
Yeah, well, it's a moving picture, isn't it? I mean, so Ines is saying that transport is the early mover, yeah?
Yes.
But again, you've got to make sure the vehicles are available. You just don't go out and sell hydrogen yet, so you have to be creative in putting projects together. Transport is probably the early mover because of the economics of it, especially as much as anything else. Especially when I'm driving here today and I'm seeing petrol and diesel at 170 and 180 per gallon and rising. So this parity with hydrogen production is getting close, yeah, from the production side of things. But you've got to stack it up and build the infrastructure and everything else, yeah? So it doesn't happen overnight. But then with the cost of gas and, as Ines is saying, with industry prices as well, maybe those big-scale markets for heating in industry are coming more quickly than we realise as well. I think we've got to be ready for those scale-up opportunities. And I'd have said this maybe a year or two ago with my fingers crossed behind my back, yeah? Thinking that, yeah, conceptually you can see it happening. Logically you can see it happening. You need to store energy at a huge scale. The wind turbines are barely turning out there today. So we know that the resource is out there, but we've got to match it with the demands. But it's these economics probably which is going to drive things forward more quickly than anything else. That's the way of the world. Investment is pouring into this area globally. So maybe we can put these links in the chain together in a Welsh microcosm, which is a very significant microcosm because we've got it all here. Industry, heating, power, agriculture as well. Cost of ammonia is going through the roof. You use hydrogen to produce ammonia, and maybe we can get some, green ammonia production facilities here in Wales. So the themes are all stacking up, and localization is another one, so that we can produce and use stuff as locally as possible, so you have that resilience and security in all these supply chains. And I won't mention any names, but anecdotally, again, there's, large companies in Wales are looking at that field now, yeah? Localization, both in terms of the stuff which is coming out of their factories for their local markets, but the stuff that goes in, the materials and the energy which goes into making things. And hydrogen runs through all of those. You cannot do green cement, green steel, green fertilizer, the fundamentals of an economy. Well, you can do it, but you can do it very dirtily, like we're doing at the moment. But you can only do them in terms of decarbonisation and clean air. There are so many themes, aren't there, without hydrogen. So, coming back to your original question, which goes first? To be honest, I think it is transport, because transport can run quite quickly. Hydrogen trains are being assessed in Wales as well, but that shouldn't mean that others cannot follow very, very quickly as well. If the off-takers are there and the economics are in place, then hopefully the rest can stack up and provide these opportunities for this huge resource which is out in the Celtic Sea and elsewhere. Not just the Celtic Sea, but all around Wales.
Thank you. And Tim, industrial consumption, industrial clusters, have you got anything to add with your experiences?
Yeah, so following on from Gitto's point, and a bit of Michelle's as well. So the UK's got a 10-point plan, 1 gigawatt production capacity by 2030. And Gitto's right, demand-led is probably your quickest route to market, whether that's transport or industrial decarbonisation. What you've got to kind of factor in as well is the production side of things. So, the engineers and probably non-engineers in the room know the second law of thermodynamics. Every time you change or convert an energy form, its ability to do work kind of lessens. So the challenge that we're going to have from probably a marine energy perspective, whilst it's technically possible, commercially it's quite challenging because it's quite an expensive technology, and as an industry we're trying to drop the cost of generation down. So, in terms of sort of the low-hanging fruit, I think there's a key around sort of focusing production around projects that are already in generation, have already got those revenue streams in place through the feed-in tariff, through the renewable obligation certificate, because then all you have to do is obviously supplement the loss of revenue from that primary or secondary revenue stream. You know, if you can do that and you've got your route to market, then not only are you going to kind of help that production side of things, but you're going to minimise some of the you're going to minimise the cost of that production to the consumer. Really important when you're based in Ofgem, considering how best to do this, and you're going to free up capacity on the onshore network, which is, you know, why some of the capacity issues that we've got around the offshore network are there, because onshore has kind of taken the capacity up over the last decade. So,
Thanks, Tim. And then moving on to Jeremy, in terms of medium to long-term opportunities for hydrogen, is heating blending part of the solution?
Potentially, but, you know, from a carbon point of view, there are other priorities, and they're the ones that Gita mentioned. So, you know, your industrial decarbonisation and transport is a far more effective way to reduce CO2. So if you put 20% of hydrogen into the gas grid, and there's a lot of people who are, you know, lobbying for that approach, your actual carbon benefit is only 7 to 8%. So actually, you've got to think bang for your buck, where's your money better spent? I think the other issue with blending at that sort of scale is, you know, back of a fag packet kind of calculation, you need 50 to 60 gigawatts of electrolyzers to do 20% gas blending for the UK's gas demand. So you've got to think, well, actually, how is that likely to be delivered? And, you know, quite possibly that will be delivered by blue hydrogen at the points where gas enters the transmission system. And if that's the case, well, that's not net zero compliant. So I think you need to focus your attention. In the longer term, though, there are opportunities for gigawatt scale electrolysis linked to offshore wind and other renewable technologies. You know, potentially also exports to countries like Germany, who simply will not have enough and probably need to import 70% of their hydrogen and wean themselves off Russian gas.
Okay. In terms of transportation, Gito, hydrogen hubs at ports, this is something you mentioned and I like the sound of.
Yeah, I think Ines mentioned ports as well, yeah, they're a key area. So we've got the Holyhead Hydrogen Hub, there's the Milford Haven project as well. Mostyn Dock, you know, there's a tidal lagoon, tidal project, yeah, in the offing there. I'm not sure whether that's connected to hydrogen yet. And there are certainly potential around the ABP ports as well, across South Wales, Cardiff, Swansea, Newport, Barry, there's another one, Port Talbot, yeah. So yeah, these are natural places to develop these hubs for production as well as use and get end use in terms of the value chain. A lot of the activities at the ports lend themselves to hydrogen anyway, yeah? Some of the vehicles which are at the ports. But also, the nature of ports, they tend to be close to cities as well, and they can bring energy from offshore and other places into those ports. When you look at it, you know, from externally, if you were looking at for a country in the world which had a lot of things which stacked up in order to really kickstart the green hydrogen value chain, you'd be difficult to find one which is better placed than Wales. Because we have resource, because we have infrastructure which can be repurposed towards hydrogen, ports and gas pipelines, because we have readily available markets and across the board as well, power, industry, heating, agriculture and transport, thank you. So you can hit all of those. There's a favourable policy regime and it will meet some of the targets. I like these comparisons with other countries, yeah? We're not unique in this, and that's one of the advantages of hydrogen. It can be distributed around the world, but we are in a unique position here, and especially in partnership with Ireland, yeah? Who have got much, even greater resource than us, but we are in a good place because of our infrastructure here. So we should certainly forge partnerships with them. But the targets are going up and up all over the world. Germany published a target a couple of years ago. I think was it 5 gigawatts or 10 gigawatts by 2030, something like that. But they keep on increasing it. Now it's up to the tens of gigawatts. Denmark, which is a country that we should closely relate to in terms of what they can do, especially given the superb success of their wind industry over 20 years, and maybe we have missed the boat there, but they've developed an indigenous industry in Denmark, which we could maybe mimic in Wales. But they published a couple of days ago a 6 gigawatt target, I think, for green hydrogen, by 2030. I've seen one of the questions here, does Wales have a target? No, we don't. We don't have a low carbon hydrogen production target yet. People like me are saying we should, we should say 5, maybe it'll be 10 gigawatts, because it gives you something to aim for. So, we've got these unique, it's not unique, but they are really special characteristics in Wales where everything can line up, but we should definitely learn from others as well. Companies based in this room have got international presence, I know, but the countries and governments who are lining up the policy regime as well. But yes, a lot of that can start from these hubs, which can definitely be based around ports, but they can connect within Wales, but also connect internationally to places like England and Ireland.
Internationally. Thank you. So moving from the opportunities onto challenges, what are the biggest challenges for hydrogen? Again, a poll of all of you picked up evolution of hydrogen technology, technical challenges, resources, cost-effective offshore production for the consumer, and securing long-term off-taker agreements. Jeremy, in terms of evolution of hydrogen technology, have you got any thoughts you'd like to share?
Gosh, yes, I have. I mean, I think, I think the biggest challenge actually is not a technical challenge in the way of, the technology. Mm-hmm. I think, Gita, you mentioned the technology has been in place for a long time. It's about how you scale that up, because last time I looked, the biggest electrolyzer in the world was 20 megawatts. And last time I looked, which was about 3 months ago, so it's probably doubled since, the pipeline of known and announced projects in the world was 30 gigawatts. And that is a huge, huge uplift in production. And so I think I went to an electrolyzer manufacturer, and they were cutting membranes by hand. So, we've got to scale up to produce gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity right across the world very quickly. And other markets are ahead of us in terms of targets and funding and everything else. So I think that will be the biggest challenge. It will literally be getting electrolyzers out and not having this huge kind of backlog of orders and production volumes, and therefore increasing and ramping up costs and delays. So I think that's the real challenge. That is the number one worry that I would have personally. I don't think it's a technical issue in terms of the technology itself. That can all be done. We know that.
It's a production line.
Yeah, it's the supply chain. Yeah. But therein lies a huge opportunity. So, if Wales had an electrolyzer manufacturer located here, for example, that could produce hundreds or gigawatts of, electrolyzers every year, how fantastic would that be? Mm-hmm.
I was quite encouraged to see the efficiencies from capillary fed electrolyzers, putting another 10% on the efficiency. Good opportunity there to, get efficiency into the process.
Yeah. And cost reductions at scale as well. I mean, clearly that's necessary. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeremy. And moving to Michelle, you mentioned resources as one of the key challenges. Would you like to talk us through what you see the resource issues are?
Yeah, absolutely. The best will in the world, we're all working with schools and colleges and, but there's going to be a skills gap. We need these projects to be working in the sort of next 10 years. The primary school children aren't going to be there, and the college students will just be sort of getting the experience they need. So it's working with the sort of oil and gas people, the renewables people, and sort of moving their skills from what they're doing and repurposing them to work with hydrogen. Because the skills that are out there, they just need to sort of look at them slightly different and sort of mould them to what we need.
Okay, thank you. Moving back to Jeremy, is hydrogen overhyped? Can it live up to its potential that we've discussed today?
In terms of overhyped, I don't think it is. I mean, we've got to wean ourselves off gas, right? And there's only so many ways to do that. Energy efficiency, convert to green gases, electrify, and that is effectively it. Some uses will need to convert to hydrogen. So UK government probably takes a fairly conservative estimate, and they reckon by 2050 we'll need 250 to 460 terawatt hours of hydrogen. That'll need to be green hydrogen. So is it overhyped? No. The whole world is realising the potential for hydrogen. The question is it deliverable? And, what needs to be done to make it happen? And that I think is the challenge. We heard from Guido that many countries have got, higher targets, bigger budgets, etc., to make this happen. So we need to compete in that space in the UK. And I think, one of those questions around targets that were mentioned, a green hydrogen target, we don't have a green hydrogen target, we have a low carbon hydrogen target. And what we need is to see the CO2 intensity of the hydrogen mix decline over time to net zero. Ultimately, that needs to be green hydrogen. So having a green hydrogen target would give green hydrogen producers something to aim at. So I think, Wales could have a low carbon hydrogen target, it could have a green hydrogen target. The UK should have a green hydrogen target.
I think we have just under 15 minutes left. Some very kind members of the audience have posted some questions for our panellists. I can barely see or read, so if anyone can help me.
I'll borrow glasses.
Yeah, go on then.
Yeah. So the first question is oh, look, you can read that now.
Yeah, so
Suddenly got bigger.
Thanks for trying, Jeremy. So the first one, the grid is constrained in Pembroke. Would electrolysers take power off the grid, and would this help grid connections in Pembrokeshire for floating offshore wind? I'm going to point this one to Tim.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess there's two types of constraint that we're looking at and observing I guess it's primarily the transmission system and the distribution system in Pembrokeshire. I mean, there's physical space on the buzz bars and space within the substations themselves to connect new capacity on, and then there's the capacity issue. How you get the energy to where it's needed. So hypothetically, yes, hydrogen production could relieve the capacity constraints, could relieve some of the issues on the capacity side, but you've still got to connect up banks of electrolysers to a buzz bar somewhere, so that's still going to kind of add to the challenges around physically getting to some of the substations. And if you're obviously looking at transmission scale, then there are some pretty tricky routes to get to that point of connection in the 400 kVA substation in Pembroke, but the landlords are lovely.
Moving on to Jeremy.
Yeah, I just want to make another point. I mean, yes, absolutely, it can take power off the grid, assuming that the government has a low-carbon hydrogen quality standard that allows that to happen. So that's a decision that needs to be made in the next few months, and it will be made, and hopefully they will do that and allow grid-connected renewables to power electrolysers. I think there's another part of this question is around the timing of that grid connection. So we all know, I think, that the grid is constrained at Pembroke. If you put electrolysers in early, it take power off the grid, it might relieve some of those constraints. So the question then becomes, how does National Grid or WPD manage the grid to make that happen? So what we can't afford to do is have demand being at the back of the queue behind, say, floating offshore wind and connecting last, because that doesn't actually help. So you need to make sure that a project like ours can connect early to the grid, so that then it takes some of that power off the grid and allows more space for floating offshore wind.
And just to partially touch on this as well, the project we are looking at the south, helping the Welsh government looking at future grid upgrade, it's about this. So this can be a short-term solution or way of managing the grid, but eventually we need to look at grid upgrade as a systemic approach to integration, because we'll still need, we talked about wave, we talked about tidal, floating wind. When we start looking at the energy mix, we still need to get those grids ready for different interactions and integration. And touching on the last questions, also, although we talked about technical limitations, there's also a challenge around the policy and policy framework, really. We've seen that in offshore wind with the CFD support. We've seen the different aspects from the policy side, from the funding, from the supply chain readiness, that beyond the technical aspect of hydrogen, we also need to look at what's attached to it, what's the policy need to do, if we have a CFD style of support, how does it work for grey, blue, green hydrogen? So yeah.
Fantastic. Geeta, I wonder if you would mind answering the first question on the list there, which is, what do you consider to be the key technical limitations that remain within green hydrogen production? And what do you think is the best approach to address these?
I think Jeremy's kind of touched on it. There's no technical barriers. There's no new inventions needed as such. We know this technology works. It's a case of scaling it up and scaling it up quickly, and of course it improves over time as well. Efficiencies get improved, materials, degradation, performance, and everything else within the electrolyzers. But this is, standard across all technologies. So we're not waiting for a magic breakthrough. If anything, we're waiting for magic breakthroughs in the innovation in policy and implementation and consents and things like that. I mean, technology is ready to go and scale up. But supply chains is another thing. You don't want to create markets and then there's bottlenecks in the production of those stuff, and that's a key thing to address over the next 2 or 3 years. And also the materials that go into these things as well. Hopefully they can be part of the circular economy, so we're not reliant on fragile supply chains. And we're seeing that with lithium and cobalt now, for example, and the prices of those, which hydrogen, although it's not perfect, it can avoid some of those bottlenecks in the global supply chains and make these things as local to market as possible. So you couple them with wind turbines. We know wind turbines work. You need pipelines. You need all the connections. You need to avoid the embrittlement of existing pipelines, but then Wales and West Utilities are putting down plastic pipes throughout the country, which are hydrogen ready. You're going to need connections for the boilers if you're in homes, and fuel cells and all these other parts of the link. But there's no major technological breakthroughs which are required for that. It's just improving on what we have. And what's good is this is not conceptual research stuff, but these trials are taking place, More than trials, they're demonstration projects, at scale in the UK, but also across the world, so we can learn from how to implement them. But I come from a technology point of view, This is where I'm fascinated in this, notwithstanding the fact that a Welshman invented the fuel cell in 1842 and nearly forgot that, William Grove, so the technology has been around for a long, long time. But if the technology doesn't work, forget about it, And some other technologies don't maybe lend themselves and, flagged up to be something which they're not in terms of this huge problem and opportunity that we have. So if the technology works, everything else then should fall into place. But I know that sounds supremely naive, but we're at a position where we've got to be really optimistic and charge on and get rid of these human-based barriers, perhaps, rather than the technological barriers.
There have been some technical challenges around the, at the transmission scale. So, you mentioned Wales and West Utilities plastic pipes, and, one of the issues that we faced in 2016 was around grids' confidence around their infrastructure. Not necessarily the pipes per se, even though they were metal and could embrittle. They were pretty confident that they were going to kind of stand the test of time, but things like the welds, the flanges, the valves, the metering points, they had some concerns around the, how increased levels of hydrogen could impact those. And whilst it was a challenge then, and 8 years later, they've got the Future Grid project, which is effectively taken decommissioned transmission assets, taking them apart, putting them together in an island situation and running at a 2, 20 and 100% hydrogen. So they're kind of gearing themselves up, whether that's 20% blend, like Jeremy mentioned, or as part of a, they're going to start transferring over sort of historic natural gas pipelines over to like a hydrogen backbone, like Project Union style, linking industrial clusters in the UK. I think that's those are the technical challenges from a NTS system point of view, which are actually getting looked at now. And I think once they're comfortable, I think the capacity will grow, because they'll be a lot more confident that their infrastructure can take the production capacity, like the guys have said, the team have said here. It's there, it just needs the support.
I feel like I'm making an advert for how great Wales is, but I will, because a lot of these things, the materials, the science of it is being advanced in Welsh universities as well. This is the Marine Energy Wales Conference, after all. So you've got materials in Swansea, for example. So you've got catalysis in Cardiff University. You've got 4 minutes, 55 seconds left to speak.
It's plenty of time.
But yeah, you've got all these excellent research-based activities, which don't say hydrogen on the prof's door handle or whatever, but they can be applied to this new area. So if the companies, the developers are in place, then there's a really significant Welsh supply chain in terms of companies, but also in terms of the material, the university know-how, which can lend itself to that. But yeah, there is much more to it than that. You've got to work internationally and collaborate on these projects. And there's a hell of a lot of tech transfer we can bring in from Germany, for example, Danish know-how, and across the world come to that. There's no limits to how you can reach across and work in partnership. But the elements, literally, that element is in place in Wales to maybe catapult things. But a lot of things have to stack up.
Thanks, Gito.
Sorry, I'm just going to add one thing. The only thing I suppose we haven't spoke about today is sort of doing this all safely.
Yes.
How do we move the hydrogen around? We've got the Maritime Hydrogen Highway project that's looking at moving it, through sea. Do we store it out at sea on old oil rigs? Do we have to build new ones? But how do we just all do it safely? I don't know the answer to that, but it is a challenge that needs to be looked at.
I think Jeremy might have some answers.
No, not on that particular point, but I was going to just suggest that one of the sort of technical barriers is around the use of hydrogen, right? So there's sort of two aspects of that. One is kind of how do you encourage demand? Because there's no point us producing hydrogen if no one wants to buy it, right? And then there are probably technical barriers around that hydrogen use. So, say you're an industry, maybe you're a bottle manufacturer, right? If you manufacture clear glass bottles, you can use hydrogen in a burner or a furnace. If you manufacture brown glass bottles, you can't. You won't get brown bottles. So there's those sort of technical problems that need to be solved around the use in order to create the demand that then hydrogen producers can meet. So there are some technical restrictions there, but there's a lot of sort of government activity, such as the Industrial Decarbonisation Accelerator, that's looking to try and solve some of those issues. So there is work going on.
Thank you.
And just to add to that, there's a program that we're supporting from BASE looking at distillery and hydrogen within the distillery sector. So in a way that is also being tested at smaller scale to see is it suitable, is it the right technology, and what's the local impact to that. So there's a few SME projects trying to test exactly that. Yeah.
That'll convince people, if nothing else does. Hydrogen-powered beer or gin, yeah? Or whiskey even.
I think we've had a really good discussion. Thank you. In terms of summing up, I think the opportunities are clear for the near and the long term. The challenge is scaling the technology up, production line, getting the right policy in place in a time-wise way. A key ask would be a green hydrogen target for Wales. And I'm going to finish on Gito's, well, I'm going to quote you here. There is no better place than Wales for hydrogen. We have the market, infrastructure and resource. Thank you.
When you look at point 2 on the on the green growth plan, you know, he talked about super places, and I think, you know, when I've been talking to politicians, it's been very much about promoting kind of primarily, you know, the assets around Milford Haven as a super place, but I think they're equally relevant to North Wales as well. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
All the industrial clusters, essentially, in Wales. Yes, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.